Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Today's founder is Mary Ball Washington, the mother of General/President George Washington. Now, Mary Ball Washington, we don't know exactly when she was born. She was born as Mary Ball, and she was born somewhere between 1707 and 1709, which, for perspective, makes her anywhere from 1 to 3 years younger than Benjamin Franklin, for perspective on how old Benjamin Franklin was compared to most of the other founders. Now, that being said, Mary Ball Washington unfortunately was orphaned by the time she was 13, and she was taken in by an uncle, George Eskridge. Now, George Eskridge raised her, and about a decade later, when she was about 20 years old, Eskridge introduced him to his recently widowed brother-in-law, Augustine Washington. Augustine Washington already had a few children, who most of whom would be famous for being older brothers of George Washington or stepbrothers of George Washington. But Mary and Augustine get married. They have six children, five of whom survive to adulthood. The first child they have, they name after George Eskridge, the man who helped raise Mary Ball and introduce the two. They name this baby George, and they give it the last name of the father, which is Washington, and this baby is none other than George Washington. Now, sadly for Washington, he's still relatively young when his father passes away. All of his older brothers end up passing away after helping him grow into a young man. That being said, Mary Ball survives for a very long time, overseeing her son, and even lives long enough to see George Washington become president of the newly formed United States of America. It's often overlooked, and we forget that. But again, her being younger than Benjamin Franklin, who also saw Washington become president, does put some perspective onto things. Now, George Washington grows up, and when he's a young man, he actually wants to join the Royal Navy. In fact, several high ranking members of Virginia society helped set him up with a career in the Royal Navy. But Mary Ball has a sibling, a brother named Joseph, who lives over in London. He writes back saying, this is not a good idea for young George to become a sailor. He won't excel in the Navy. There's only so much promotion he'll ever get as a colonial born citizen. Instead, take the little bit of land he has and the servants, as they call them, the 3 or 4 slaves that Washington had at just 19 years old. Take those and try and become a planter. He should be able to get into the upper class eventually. And because of this scenario, Washington basically is demanded by his mother. There is a little bit of question about how demanding she was. She, for a long time, was celebrated as a hero, as the mother of Washington, but recent historical scholarship has kind of viewed her as a little bit more demanding with her child. But either way, their relationship, strained as it may have been at times, and we will get to that, Mary Ball Washington essentially recommends that George not go to sea and instead take up a job at home. And it's because of this discussion that Washington stays home and becomes a surveyor. And this career works out very swimmingly for him, as we know. He ends up getting a whole lot of land, a whole lot of property, eventually a good amount of slaves, and a great established place in colonial Virginia society, eventually even becoming a member of the House of Burgesses, the colonial government. Now, Mary Ball Washington, she gets old, and in 1771, she can no longer really live in the woods at the old plantation that she lived on. So George Washington actually buys her a house in Fredericksburg, Virginia, by his sister slash her daughter Betty and her husband, and they are just about a block away, and she is able to live very close. And then George Washington, goes to war, and throughout the war and the rest of his life, Mary Ball Washington is a little bit of a thorn in her son's side. She is pretty constantly looking for more and more money. Now, George Washington, as I said, buys his mom a house and is constantly giving her money to live a fairly wealthy lifestyle. Again, he tries to persuade her to move in with his sister Betty, but she wants to live independently, stay in her garden in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And eventually in 1781, Mary Ball really embarrasses her son, Commander in Chief of the Continental Army, just about to go to Yorktown, George Washington, by applying for a pension from the young state of Virginia, saying, hey, I don't have enough money to take care of myself. I need to be a burden on the state. Please take care of me. Fortunately for General George, he has some buddies over there, notably Governor and Declaration of Independence signer Benjamin Harrison, who writes to George and says, "Hey man, what's your mother talking about over here?" And George writes back and says, "Don't give her money. I've given her plenty of money." The quote I saw, he said, I'll paraphrase, but essentially he says, if she needs more money, we will get her more money. But she has plenty of money. I bought her a house. Is more or less what he sends back to Governor Harrison, who again is a friend of George Washington's. They had both been to the First Continental and then Second Continental Congresses together. So that kind of blows over, as embarrassing an episode it is for someone like George Washington, who had spent a lifetime attempting to become one of the elites. I've heard Washington described as the poor kid at the rich charter school. Essentially was his place in Virginia society. He was wealthy enough to be one of the elites, but he was always right at the bottom tier trying to make his way up. And this was a very embarrassing moment for him. Fortunately, as I said, it does blow over. George Washington, wins the war, so there's not a whole lot he can do wrong at that point. But in 1789, when the United States government has been created and George Washington is elected the first president, as I said, his mother and most of his brothers and sister are still alive. And Washington, on his way from Mount Vernon up to New York City to take his position as president, first president of the United States, on his way in April 1789, he stops in Fredericksburg, Virginia, to visit his mother for one final time. His mother is at this point suffering from breast cancer. He essentially knows it's the last time he will see his mother. He's there for about 2 days. Now, legend has it, while he's there, his mother, he asked permission from and is granted permission by his mother to go get this new job of President of the United States. In much the same fashion, he had asked her for permission to join the Navy so many decades earlier. And as the story goes, Mary Ball says, something along the lines of, "Yes, my son, you may go be like the first president." Now, unfortunately, this story is mostly hearsay. It is a legend, a myth that has blossomed over time. As I mentioned earlier, Mary Ball Washington became a very mythical figure in the early 18 and mid 1800s. And nowadays, scholarship may have gone a little too far the other way. Scholarship nowadays is a little bit harsh on her, when it's probably somewhere more in the middle. She does seem to have been kind of a demanding mother who kept asking for money all of Washington's life, but it's a nice story saying, hey, Mom, can I go be president now? And Mary Ball Washington saying, "Yeah, son, you can go be president now." And he does. He leaves and he goes up to New York City, and that's the last meeting he has with his mother. Unfortunately, she dies the following August 1789 of breast cancer that she had been suffering from for a long time. It's interesting, too, because Washington writes back to his sister after hearing about this, and while he does say, it's obviously a grief that our mother has passed away, but she had already been pretty advanced in age, and she was sick, so she's probably in a better place now. But he also notes about how she kept asking him for money, even in this final letter to his sister, consoling his sister about their mother. He has this, at least we don't have to give her any more money tenor to the conversation, which is fascinating. And on top of this, not Washington society at this point, still New York City society, but the capital, the new government, which is less than a year old, has a few weeks of unofficial mourning from the people in the government. It is another moment of unification at this very important time, after the Anti-Federalist and Federalist debates during the ratification process, which was very divisive. It is one of these moments that kind of brings people together, and you'd see something similar almost about 6 months later when Benjamin Franklin also passes away. It's another one of these moments that kind of bring people together in solidarity. For George's sake, he actually wears a black armband for the next 5 months. So the remainder of his first year as president, he spends half of that year wearing a badge representing the passing of his mother. Another interesting fact is that Washington's mother never actually gets a gravestone. For some inexplicable reason, he doesn't give his mother a gravestone. And after George himself passes away 10 years later, this is during the first generation, the early 1800s, as I said, where Mary Bell Washington kind of became a mythical figure. It's during this time that they look around and they're like, why doesn't she have a gravestone? And it took until 1890, over 100 years after her death, before a monument was finally erected. Actually, there was a monument erected in 1890, but it was in the 1830s that she was given a small, normal gravestone. And that procedure, or should I say ceremony, was actually overseen in the speech that was given, the oration that was given at that time, was actually by sitting President Andrew Jackson, giving an homage to George Washington's mother, a person. Washington and Jackson's relationship was brief. It existed. It was brief, and we're not here to get into that. But what we were here to get into was the life of Mary Bell Washington, a fascinating study. I was really enthralled learning about her this afternoon, so I hope you enjoyed it almost as much as I did. Thank you for watching. If you did enjoy this video, definitely hit like. That's amazing. And if you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos 7 days a week. Usually they're shorter than this one, but there's a lot to talk about when it comes to George Washington's mommy. Thank you again, and I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.